Good day. Today is Tuesday, 4th March 2025. If reports are true, then over the last 24 hours, the Trump administration has made what is perhaps its most consequential decision in relation to the Ukrainian crisis. I say if reports are true because there's been no official or public statement that I'm aware of made by the United States, just briefings by anonymous, our usual friends, the anonymous American officials. There's word that Donald Trump himself is going to make some kind of public statement later today. Well, we'll see if he does. Donald Trump says many things. However, he makes many statements, and one can't be certain that he's going, if he does make a statement, that it will be about the decision that I'm going to discuss now. And that is the decision to stop further arms deliveries to Ukraine. Now, there's been lots of intrigue about this question going back to the early days of Donald Trump's presidency, his second term. Firstly, as I very well remember, in the first couple of days, directly after the Trump administration started to take the axe to USAID, we got a whole cluster of reports that there'd been some kind of aid stop by the Trump administration on Ukraine, that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, had given some kind of order stopping all aid to Ukraine. And then shortly after that, as I also remember, we got reports starting to appear, including an official statement from the Pentagon, that the aid stop only concerned civilian aid provided by the State Department. Military aid from the Pentagon still continued in accordance with the previous drawdowns made by the Biden administration on the back of the $61 billion congressional authorization made in April last year. That aid supposedly still continued. And then a couple of days later, we got further reports which suggested that military aid had stopped after all. I came to the view that what was probably going on was that there were various packages of aid provided to Ukraine. There was aid provided directly by the Pentagon, which came out of Pentagon stockpiles and which was pursuant to the exercise of President Biden's drawdown authority. And my view was that that aid was unaffected by the aid stop. But there was also further aid, funding in fact, provided through the State Department to the Ukrainian government, aid which enabled Ukraine, at least in theory, to buy weapons in the United States. And it seemed as if that aid had indeed been stopped. Anyway, the exact position was never fully clarified, at least not to my knowledge, when I suggested that once Pete Hegseth, the new US Defense Secretary, managed to get his confirmation sorted out, which he did some weeks ago, and once the leadership of the Pentagon was changed, then perhaps we would start to get clarity. And, well, it seems, though I stress again, we've had no official public announcement so far, it seems that that clarity has come. Now, a lot of the commentary relates this decision to stop all military aid, supplies of all military equipment from the United States to Ukraine, which we are told has now been made. A lot of this related to the events of last week. Zelensky's disastrous visit to the United States, his furious row with J.D. Vance and Donald Trump in the Oval Office, the bitter words and recrimination that have followed, all of that. But I'm going to suggest that, in fact, this process was probably already underway, and one of the factors that perhaps led to the decision being made now was the change in the leadership, the military leadership in the Pentagon. Over the last couple of days, Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth have basically sacked the leadership, the military leadership. The chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Brown, the invisible man, as I have called him, has left the scene. Other top US military officers have also left the scene. Apparently there's a new group of top military people coming in and taking charge in the Pentagon, though they will, it must be added, require confirmation from the Senate. I would have thought that in the case of American generals, that should not be difficult to obtain, by the way. But anyway, it seems to me that though the decision to stop all military aid to Ukraine may not have been triggered or made possible by the sacking of all these top Biden-appointed generals. The fact that those Biden-appointed generals have now indeed been sacked has perhaps led us to the point of the decision that was made yesterday. It's strange, at least to me, that nobody has made the linkage. Anyway, to repeat, we have not yet had official confirmation that this aid stop, this military aid stop, has indeed taken place. Now, the reports say that the aid stop is not fully complete. Deliveries of actual weapons from the United States to Ukraine will indeed end. However, Ukraine will continue to receive intelligence from the United States. All the intelligence sharing arrangements that were set in place by the Biden administration still continue. And in fact, this intelligence information has been at least as important for Ukraine as the delivery of the weapons themselves. So to give an example, Ukraine will still receive information about targets inside Russia, which it can then use in order to carry out drone attacks on those targets. And of course, it goes far beyond that. Ukraine will continue to receive battlefield intelligence from the United States. That will continue to be supplied, at least for the time being. So that's one thing. The second is that apparently the Starlink system, which technically is not covered by the Pentagon anyway, it's not provided by the United States government. Starlink is a private enterprise owned by, ultimately, or at least controlled by, Elon Musk. Anyway, that continues to provide the vital communication services to Ukraine. There's no word that that is being interrupted or interfered with. And some of these US officials that have been speaking to the media and telling us about this aid stop have gone out of their way to say that this is not a permanent cessation of military aid by the United States to Ukraine. It is just a pause, that aid has been paused because the Trump administration has been incensed, infuriated by the behavior of Vladimir Zelensky over the course of his trip to Washington, his row with J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, the clear indications that he is not interested in negotiating peace with the Russians, that he's not, in fact, interested in peace with the Russians at all. And, well, as a result, the United States has come to the conclusion, and this is hinted at, by the way, in Donald Trump's latest message on Truth Social, that Zelensky remains committed to the war. He wants to continue the war indefinitely. And, well, Donald Trump said on Truth Social that Zelensky's comments whilst on his trip in Europe, that the war would go on for a long, long time, was a further confirmation that he's not interested at all in making peace, and that there's no sense, therefore, in the United States continuing to supply weapons to Ukraine, which will enable Zelensky to just keep the war going. In fact, Trump went further, and as indeed he pointed out to Zelensky over the course of their argument in the Oval Office, what is happening is that instead of the United States, its support for Ukraine being used by Ukraine as a mechanism to put itself in a better position in order to negotiate a way to peace, the continued assistance provided to Ukraine by the United States has instead enabled Ukraine to continue and prolong the war. By the way, I can remember Vladimir Putin making exactly the same point years ago, I believe all the way back in 2022, that American weapons deliveries to Ukraine, far from leading to peace, was simply creating conditions for an extension, an indefinite extension of the war. And I would add that I believe that on this point, Trump obviously is right. Anyway, that was what Donald Trump said on Truth Social. This unannounced, or at least formally unannounced, decision to stop all military aid to Ukraine, at least physical military aid, aid in weapons and that sort of thing, that is in line with what Trump has said on Truth Social. And, well, as I said, it's not complete. American assistance to Ukraine continues. Intelligence cooperation and supply of information to Ukraine continues. Starlink remains in operation. We're told that this cessation of aid is a pause rather than an indefinite permanent stop. But it is consistent with what Trump is saying, and it's clearly, as American officials say, it's clearly intended to push Ukraine to move towards negotiations with Russia. Now, it could be intended to do something else as well, though Donald Trump categorically denied this yesterday, in the sense that Zelensky has probably convinced the Americans over the course of the last week, as he long ago convinced the Russians, that he absolutely does not want peace. In fact, the way he has spoken, the way he behaved at the Oval Office meeting, probably convinced the Americans. In fact, I've no doubt that it convinced the Americans that even if he was pulled kicking and screaming to the negotiating table, any negotiation between Ukraine and Russia, which took place whilst Zelensky was there at the table, would, on Ukraine's side, be completely insincere. In other words, the Americans have come to see Zelensky as the problem rather than part of the solution to the problem. They've come to sense that he's fundamentally uninterested in peace, that he doesn't want peace, that he sees his own political future tied up with an indefinite prolongation of the war, something I've been saying for a very long time, by the way, that he will never negotiate peace willingly, and that if he is brought into a negotiation process with the Russians, he will wreck it by making impossible and extreme demands, something which apparently he was warned against doing by Vance and Rubio during their meeting with him during the Munich Security Conference. Just saying. But that is most likely what Zelensky will do, and he will do the same thing as he did in his meeting with Trump and Vance in the Oval Office. He will always say that the Russians are not to be trusted, that they're acting in bad faith, and he will seize on any issue that the Russians bring up or any action that they take in order to confirm this. And, well, if that is the assumption that the Americans are making, I think, by the way, that they are absolutely right. I discussed yesterday in my program how Zelensky's most recent claim that he lost any belief in ceasefires with the Russians because of the way in which the Russians supposedly breached the ceasefire that was agreed following the signing of the Minsk I agreement in September 2014. I pointed out that that makes absolutely no sense, that Zelensky was elected in 2018, I believe, or 2019 to try 2018 to make the Minsk agreement work, that is completely inconsistent with his supposed disillusion with the Russians, dating all the way back to 2014. But the point is, and perhaps this is the more pertinent point, my recollection of events in the autumn of 2014 and in the early weeks of 2015 is that it was not the Russians, who were not formally a party of the dispute at all anyway at that time, or even the Donbass militias, who actually violated the ceasefire in any major way. I'm not saying that there weren't some actions taken by them which could be classified as ceasefire violations, but that the major steps to undermine the ceasefire were taken by the Ukrainians. They did not withdraw their forces from the contact line, especially not their heavy weapons, as they agreed to do in the September 2014 ceasefire, and as they again, by the way, agreed to do in the February 2015 ceasefire, the February 2015 ceasefire that was part of Minsk II, the main Minsk agreement. The Ukrainians refused to do that. And my own sense at the time and since is that the ceasefire finally completely broke down in the early weeks of 2015, not because the militias were violating it, but because President Poroshenko, the then Ukrainian president, and the Ukrainian leadership decided to try again and to relaunch the offensive that had failed in the summer of 2014, trying this time a new approach, which was to advance through the central areas of Donbass and cut the two parts of the Donbass, the two Donbass republics, from each other by seizing the town of Debaltsevo and by advancing beyond it. So the point is, and the point I'm trying to make just by rehashing this old history, is that though Zelensky talks about Russian ceasefire violations, the story of the conflict up to now is of more of Ukrainian ceasefire violations. Bear in mind that after February 2015, the Ukrainians refused to implement Minsk II. The former Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko, has now openly said that he never had any intention of implementing Minsk II. And as articles have confirmed, in the American media itself, the Ukrainians, after signing Minsk II in February 2015, launched a program of assassination which involved murdering various Donbass militia leaders and even some people in Russia. So that's the real story, that Zelensky comes along and talks to the Americans and discusses and brings up the topic of Russian ceasefire violations. As I said, the Russians would be furious about this and they would have their own points to make. And Zelensky talked about that. He talked, of course, about the Americans giving security guarantees. I suspect that Trump and certainly J.D. Vance are familiar with some parts of the truth, and they probably saw very quickly through what Zelensky was really trying to do. So I think the Americans, listening to Zelensky, seeing the way he behaved in the Oval Office, probably understand, as I said, that he's part of the problem, not the solution, that he is not interested in peace. As I said, I think they set up the mineral extraction deal more than anything else as a test of good faith, seeing whether Zelensky would sign a deal that could only be made to work after a peace agreement was reached, setting it in front of Zelensky to see whether he would sign the deal as a sign that he really was interested in peace. And they saw that he was not really prepared to sign it, that he came into the meeting determined to extract from the Americans that promise of military aid, a military alliance in effect. It's referred to as a security guarantee, but it is an obligation by the United States to defend Ukraine. He came to that meeting with that demand. He'd previously said, prior to visiting the White House, that he would not sign the mineral rights agreement unless he got that guarantee. He said again that he would not agree to a ceasefire without an American military guarantee. He repeated all of that in London after his meeting with the Americans in the White House. He said that during the summit in London. He said that again during his interview with Fox in the hours after the meeting. All of this will have confirmed to the Americans that he was really not interested in peace. Now, there are two other aspects of the White House meeting that I was unaware of, but which I have been told about, and which cast Zelensky's behavior from the perspective of Trump and Vance, arguably in an even worse light. Now, I assumed that after Zelensky arrived in the United States, the first thing he would do would be to travel to the White House and meet with Trump there. Subsequently, I learned that he'd actually had a meeting with senators and that the senators, in fact, tried to give Zelensky advice about how he should act when he met Trump and the proper protocols he should follow, advice which he chose to ignore. I read all about that in The Guardian. I assumed that this was a bilateral, bipartisan group of senators. It now seems, or at least I now understand, that the senators that Zelensky actually met with were predominantly Democrats or people who he assumed were friends on the Republican side. And I understand that he might even have had a private meeting exclusively with Democrats, and that the major figure amongst them was Senator Murphy, who is, of course, an outspoken supporter of Ukraine, but also an outspoken critic and opponent of President Trump. Now, I have to say, I always thought it was strange, given that the purpose of the visit was to meet Donald Trump and to sign this mineral rights agreement, that Zelensky would have met with senators before doing that. I would have thought that the proper way to conduct a visit would be to meet the president, have a friendly meeting with the president, have photo calls, go through a effusive and happy press conference, attend the signing ceremony when the mineral rights agreement would have been signed, not by Zelensky and Trump, but by government ministers who had come along as part of the team. And then, only after all that was done, go ahead and go perhaps to Capitol Hill and meet the senators there. That, I would have thought, would be the correct thing to do. Well, it was done otherwise. And if it is true, and I believe it is true, that the people that Zelensky mostly met with were Democrats, and perhaps at one point exclusively met with were Democrats, then it must have seemed to Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and other members of the administration that Zelensky, before meeting with the president, was giving up time to confer with the president's political opponents. And I suspect that that will have soured the mood in advance of the visit even further. So that was something I didn't fully understand, but it seems it's part of what happened. And then there was something else, because apparently it appears that before Zelensky came to the White House, in fact, before he even left Kiev, he had been informed that Donald Trump was expecting him to arrive in the White House dressed in a suit and tie. Now, I've discussed this in many places and many times. I've said that I think for a leader of any kind to come to the White House dressed informally in that kind of way is inappropriate and arguably discourteous and disrespectful. But it seems that Zelensky deliberately ignored a request from the President of the United States to come to the White House in proper formal dress. Now, again, some people are treating this as inconsequential. I do not. I never did, by the way. But it seems, going beyond this, that Trump again saw this as something of a test on Zelensky's part. This is what I have been told, and I believe it to be true, by the way, that Trump had Zelensky come dressed formally in a suit and tie, that is to say, in civilian clothes, would have recognized that as a sign that Zelensky was interested in making peace, But Zelensky turning up to the White House, effectively in his tired, well, I suppose you could call it battle gear, was a further sign to Trump that Zelensky was not really interested in peace, but that he was interested in war. He continues to see himself as a war leader, and that Trump saw this as a sign that Zelensky is still set on making the war continue. Now, all of this brings me back to my point that the Americans are presenting this latest military aid stop, or pause as they put it, as intended to bring the Ukrainians to the negotiating table, bring Zelensky himself to the negotiating table. But as the Americans clearly now see Zelensky himself as the problem, I wonder whether, at some level, despite Donald Trump's denials, they aren't hoping that this will precipitate events in Kiev leading to Zelensky's departure, to him, as a US official said about 2 weeks ago, taking the flight to Paris, packing his bags, taking the flight to Paris, staying there and letting someone else take his place. Now, it could be that the military stop will achieve that precise objective, that Zelensky will take the hint, understand that Ukraine is not going to continue to get any sort of military aid from the United States whilst he is president. I don't believe that the Americans believe that Zelensky will change his stance. I've explained why. I think that they've seen him and got the measure of him, and that they now understand that he's committed to war and will never change his stance, and that he sees his entire future as now tied to the war, and that he will never let it go. So I think that the Americans would be delighted to see the back of him. They understand what an impossible and reckless individual he actually is. But I'm not sure that they will get what they want, even despite the military pause. Zelensky himself has made it very clear that he doesn't see himself going anywhere. I discussed, I think, either in my program yesterday or at least in a very recent program, that Zelensky looks more entrenched in Kiev than he has done at any point, arguably, since the special military operation began. His most visible adversary, Zelensky, is now in effect in exile in London. There are people in Kiev, Poroshenko and Klitschko, who could be described as his opponents, but Poroshenko is under continuous surveillance and has been arrested several times and has been sanctioned, and apparently no longer even has access to his bank accounts, and he must live under constant fear of arrest, and apparently he's been investigated and could be prosecuted for treason charges. And Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, never, in my opinion, the sharpest knife in the drawer. Anyway, he has also been under pressure. Recently, one of his closest associates was also arrested. And to be frank, anyway, I think Klitschko's period of prominence in Ukrainian political life faded. His star faded a long time ago. There remains Yulia Tymoshenko, who continues to be present in Kiev. Many people speak of her as a highly intelligent figure. She used to be one of the major players in Ukrainian politics. She got herself invited to Donald Trump's inauguration something which Zelensky was unable to do, conceivably she could perhaps return in some form. But I have to also say that her star has also faded in Ukrainian politics and did so a long time ago. I get the sense that she's not especially popular in Ukraine anymore. And to be honest, I think her time has also passed. So, unless someone from within Zelensky's own team decides to turn on him, I don't really see how it's possible now to remove him. The military is now under control. General Syrskyi, who was appointed to his post by Zelensky and who's unpopular with the military anyway, is not, frankly, in a position to lead a coup. I get the sense that the military is now riddled with, well, let's call them secret police people, informers, if you like, and of course the militant and ultra-nationalist brigades are hardly likely to take action to bring to power someone who, in place of Zelensky, might sign a peace agreement with Russia. So, whereas a coup in Ukraine was a real possibility a year ago, I have to say that I don't think it is a possibility any longer. I think that it would be something extremely difficult to engineer now. And that's putting aside the reports that Zelensky now has a Praetorian Guard of French security officials whose presence will presumably also deter a coup being mounted against him. So, unless Zelensky achieves some kind of sudden, complete conversion, which I don't believe, and which the Americans are likely to mistrust, then I have to say, if the Americans follow through with what they're doing, then I suspect that this military pause that we are seeing is going to gradually acquire about it a quality of permanence. That is, of course, if the Americans stick to their position. In fact, I would go further still, and I would say that I suspect that in time, as Zelensky and his team dig in, we'll start to see the other pillars of American support start to be pulled away as well. First, the intelligence cooperation, and then in time maybe the Starlink system as well. Now, over the course of the last couple of hours, various Ukrainian officials, including the Ukrainian Prime Minister Shmyhal, are saying that this American military aid stop is not going to make such a huge difference, that Ukraine has all sorts of means and resources to keep on fighting, that it'll be able to hold the front lines, even though the front lines, in fact, are already buckling and have been doing so for some time, but that Ukraine is going to be able to hold the front lines even without American aid. And, well, for a couple of months, the reports say Ukraine has enough weapons to keep fighting, though the level of depletion of Ukraine's weapons is now very, very fast. And, well, according to the Russians, literally hundreds of infantry fighting vehicles have been destroyed, especially in Kursk region. And, well, with no replacement in sight for them, every tank and armoured vehicle that is lost in this way is likely to weaken Ukraine still further. By the way, there are reports that Ukraine has now lost irretrievably 40 of the Leopard 2 tanks that it was supplied by Germany, that there's apparently confirmation of this, and 19 of the 31 Abrams tanks supplied by the United States. Those, especially the Leopard 2 figure, might be an underestimate, by the way. But anyway, put all that aside, the Ukrainians may have, according to some reports I'm reading today, enough weapons to keep fighting for several months, at least. That may be true. So that is what the Ukrainians are saying, that they can keep going. They're still talking about the enormous success of their drone operations, that their drones are holding back the Russians right across the front lines and are starting to inflict real hurt and damage on the Russians far deep in their rear, that they're damaging the Russian economy, all of that. And the Ukrainians also correctly point out that even if the Starlink system is completely cut off, though it will pose immense challenges for them, they've still been able to conduct operations in Kursk region, where of course Starlink doesn't work for them. So they've been able to maintain some communications, enough communications in Kursk region to keep on fighting there, even without Starlink. So the rhetoric from Kiev for the moment is that this is no big deal. This military pause is something that Ukraine can absorb and keep going with, at least for the next few months. Now, I'm going to say more about this in a moment, but the key thing to say is that with all the Ukrainian officials saying that, that is a sign that they intend to stick with Zelensky, at least for the moment, or at least so it seems to me. And as I said previously, Zelensky doesn't seem to be interested in changing his mind. He's given interviews in which he says that he's happy to sign the mineral extraction deal, but he wants the Americans to treat him as an equal, which is an absurd proposition, by the way, for Zelensky to make at this time. And anyway, that takes us back to what he really wants. He really wants, as I said, this open-ended military commitment from the United States to defend Ukraine. And Zelensky has also been saying that he still won't agree to a ceasefire. I discussed that at length in my program yesterday. And he still wants, obviously, the guarantees. And he's not interested in a ceasefire at all. He really doesn't want to have a ceasefire without the guarantees. That isn't something that he wants to do. So it seems to me, as I said, if you look at this, that if the Americans are hoping that this military pause is going to cause Zelensky to change his stance, they're probably going to be disappointed. And if they are expecting the Ukrainians to turn on Zelensky, well, I don't think that Zelensky's opponents will be able to mount a challenge to him from within Ukraine. And I don't myself believe Zelensky's entourage will do it either. For the moment, they seem to be rallying to him. And I have to say, I can again see why. I don't think Zelensky is a remotely popular figure in Ukraine today. I am deeply mistrustful of the various opinion polls that circulate in Ukraine, which show that Zelensky still has the trust of more than of the majority of the Ukrainian people. There was that article in The Spectator which cast doubt on the opinion polls, and I think that article is absolutely true. But The reality is, if we're talking about people from within Ukraine, Zelensky's entourage, who amongst them is really in a position to take over from him and establish himself as a credible and convincing leader of Ukraine, and who could be accepted as such by the wider Ukrainian population? Prime Minister Shmyhal, Andrei Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff. It seems to me that Yermak's power is entirely dependent on Zelensky remaining president. I would have thought that Yermak, therefore, would want to keep Zelensky president rather than remove him. Just saying. Mikhailo Podolyak, who's no more than an advisor, who conceivably could take Podolyak seriously. Who else? Syrskyi, the deeply unpopular military chief. I really can't see it. So, why would these people want to move against Zelensky and precipitate the crisis of the regime? There would undoubtedly be immediate challenges. There would certainly be demands for elections. I can't imagine any one of these people being in a position to retain control for very long. So I don't myself see how an internal challenge to Zelensky from within his own entourage can work. So I don't see the members of what you might call the Maidan opposition, Poroshenko, Zaluzhny, Klitschko, now being able to mount a serious challenge. A year ago, it was still possible, but they bottled out of it, probably because the West at that time made their emphatic support for Zelensky very clear. And I can't see anybody from within Zelensky's team mounting a challenge either. There's a lot of talk about Alexei Arestovich, Zelensky's former spin doctor, but as I understand it, he's in exile, I believe in New York. I don't know how much support he has in Ukraine. I doubt he has the contacts with the military, and I certainly don't think he has the support of the nationalist brigades. I don't see how he can arrange the overthrow of Zelensky or anything like that. So, the Americans face a very difficult position. They're stuck with Zelensky, whom they no longer trust. The Russians, of course, stopped trusting Zelensky long ago. So, if one projects this forward, I'm going to say that the events of the last 24 hours, and this is why I see them as consequential, must be understood, whatever the Americans may be saying to each other, as leading to an eventual permanent stop of American military aid to Ukraine. Now, that does not preclude moves towards a negotiated settlement entirely. The way I think this is most likely to play out is as follows. I think that Zelensky will dig in. I don't think he's temperamentally capable of giving Donald Trump the apology that Donald Trump is said to be looking for. I don't think the Ukrainian leadership, any part of the Ukrainian leadership, let alone Zelensky himself, are prepared for the moment to concede on any of the substantive issues. The ceasefire that Trump wants, the Russians don't want a ceasefire either, But at the moment, it's the Ukrainians who are telling the Americans to their faces that they're not going to accept a ceasefire without security guarantees. The agreement to give up territories, the territories in eastern Ukraine, NATO membership, though given the kind of security guarantees the Ukrainians are asking for, frankly, that essentially equalizes the issue of NATO membership, though it would probably ultimately lead to the providing of the granting of NATO's membership if it was ever provided. I don't think that the Ukrainians, for the moment, are in any mood to give in on any of the key security issues or substantive issues that caused the breakdown in discussions with the Americans on Friday. So I think that the Ukrainians will dig in. Zelensky will dig in. He will be able to see off any challenge to his authority. I think Ukrainian society as a whole is far too fragmented and demoralized to mount any kind of popular challenge. And besides, a popular challenge needs leaders. And where are they going to come from? There is a pervasive security apparatus functioning across Ukraine, and currently it is loyal to Zelensky himself. And, well, I suspect that many of them see their future also linked to the survival of the regime in Kiev. So I think that for the next couple of months, we're probably going to see a continuation of the fighting, continued Russian advances, and I think the calculation in Kiev is going to be very, very much the same as the calculations that were made by the South Vietnamese leadership in Saigon over the course of 1974 and early 1975, which is that they are not going to make any concessions. They don't really believe that the Americans are going to stand by their commitment, not their decision not to provide military aid. I think they assume that if they hold out long enough, the Americans will eventually come round to their thinking, and that if anything really bad happens, if the Russians reach the Dnieper or perhaps cross it, then the Americans will come to their rescue. I think, as I said, the assumption is that the Americans ultimately are bluffing. I think that's what the Ukrainians are saying to each other, and that all that Ukraine needs to do is to wait the Americans out and to call their bluff. And I have to say this, I think that the actions that took place in London on Sunday are going to reinforce that view in Kiev. Now, there are different views about what took place in London on Sunday. The British diplomat, former British diplomat, Ian Proud, takes a much more optimistic view of the events last week and on Sunday in terms of what the British are doing than I have to say I do. He takes the view that the main British objective at the moment is to rebuild relations with the United States, or at least to build relations with the United States. That he, I think, bases a lot of his hopes on certain statements, comments made in an interview by the British ambassador to the United States, Lord Mandelson. Lord Mandelson said that the right thing for President Zelensky to do was to go back to the United States, sign the mineral extraction deal with the Americans, try to patch things up with the Americans, and to work with the Americans as the Americans move forward towards the ceasefire and the negotiations with the Russians. All wise advice to the Ukrainians from Lord Mandelson. And I would like to believe that they reflect British policy. But in the hours after Lord Mandelson made those comments, the British government distanced itself from them, saying that Mandelson was talking on his own initiative and that his opinions did not reflect those of the British government. Now, it may be that Starmer, who's now talking about a peace plan of his own, though we've had no word so far as to what the details of that peace plan is. Anyway, it could be that Starmer really is trying eventually to work the Ukrainians to accept American leadership, to get the Americans to embrace a peace initiative, to move forward with that peace initiative. As I said, Ian Proud's opinions about this are emphatically not to be discounted. You can see them all in a very fine discussion we had with him on the Duran. But I have to say, if that is indeed the British objective, then it is at odds with the rhetoric, which, put aside the fact that it is continues to be harshly critical of the Russians, critical to an extreme degree, continues to give the impression, the public impression, that Britain and the European states are giving the Ukrainians their full-throated support. So we had the extraordinary, I thought, appalling spectacle, incredibly ill-judged spectacle of Prime Minister Starmer hugging Zelensky outside Downing Street, just hours after Zelensky has come out of a public row with the President of the United States. Now, as I said, if that is a way of trying to build a bridge to the President of the United States, of trying to move Zelensky in an American direction, I don't really see how it works. I would have thought that the Americans looking at that will be angry and we'll see Starmer embracing Zelensky after Zelensky has quarreled with the Americans. And I can't imagine that that will make the Americans very pleased. And Zelensky himself surely is going to interpret this hug and all the words of support that he was given over the course of the London summit, and all the talk about American security guarantees that the British and the French are still talking about, and all the talk about deploying European, that is to say British and French peacekeeping forces, he surely is going to interpret that as European support for his position. And I think that is also going to be the sentiment in Kiev as well. I talked about the difficulties that Zelensky's domestic opponents would have in the event that they tried to oust Zelensky from his position as president. I'm going to say it. I think that the pictures from London, which continue to give the impression that Zelensky has London's support and the support of the Europeans as well, is going to make any moves to try to push Zelensky out in Kiev even more difficult. Let's assume that someone in Kiev, Mayor Klitschko, for example, were to decide that this is the moment to move against Zelensky. Klitschko will be watching all those pictures from London, listening to all these statements by the European leaders, and he'll be saying to himself, well, this isn't going to work because the Europeans are going to oppose me. They're going to continue to back Zelensky. And if there is a political crisis in Kiev, a crisis in which I try to engineer Zelensky's removal, the Europeans will throw their weight behind Zelensky and I will lose. So, again, I can't really see how this is going to work. I think that if there is a British or European plan to get on side with the Americans, then the language, the pictures that came out of London are going to be diametrically in contradiction with that. So anyway, that's what I'm going to say about this. I think that Zelensky is going to dig in. I think the Ukrainians are going to dig in. I think the calculation in Kiev is that the Americans are bluffing, that if the Russians reach the Dnieper or cross the Dnieper in some place, that or defeat the Ukrainians in Kursk, or if the Russian army again reaches the outskirts of Kiev, the Americans are going to panic. They're going to throw all of their policies to the winds, and they're going to rush to Ukraine's rescue. That is what President Thieu of South Vietnam and his officials are known to have said to each other in the autumn of 1974 and in the spring of 1975. It is what President al-Ghani of Afghanistan and his officials said to each other as well in Kabul after the Americans pulled out, that the Americans aren't really going to go. They're not going to allow the huge humiliation and embarrassment of seeing us fall. And I think the Ukrainians are going to say the same thing to themselves. And, well, I think that the war, therefore, is going to continue for the next 3 months. I think that the Ukrainians will have difficulty holding the Russians back over the next 3 months. There's a huge amount of discussion about this on the internet today. The Ukrainians are going out of their way to saying that they're successfully holding back the Russians, that Russian advances weren't as rapid in February as they were in January and December, that the Russians are running out of steam, that this is no longer an artillery war, that drones are the major weapon that's being used by both sides, all of that kind of thing. That's all out there on the internet today, that the Ukrainians think that they can hold back the Russians for a couple of months. I think, on the contrary, we're going to see, with the spring thaw out of the way, Russian advances then start to accelerate, just as they did in the spring of last year. I think the Russians are busy re-equipping and rearming. I think they've got more tanks and men and machines coming into play. And besides, I think that it completely misunderstands the events of February to think that the Russians have slowed down. The Russians have recently captured Velikaya Novosilka in southern Donbass. They are advancing west from Velikaya Novosilka. They're making it quite clear. If you go to Russian channels and places like Redovka, they're saying that their objective now is to complete the encirclement of and destruction of Ukraine's Khortytsa army group, which is the force that has been fighting in southern Donbass, basically to destroy this force east of the Dnieper River, and that this is what the Russians are primarily focused on at the moment. I think the Russians also, by the way, are heavily focused at the moment on defeating the Ukrainian forces in Kursk region. They have now established fire control over the main supply road to Suja in over several places. Ukrainians are already suffering major difficulties in supplies, keeping their forces in Suja supplied. During the period of the spring thaw, with the Ukrainians unable to use the country roads and dirt tracks as easily as they would at any other time of year, the logistical problems for the Ukrainians are going to get worse. I think that, as I said, come the spring, we're going to probably see, come the end of the spring thaw, which will probably last 2 or 3 weeks. Come the end of the three war, we're going to see events accelerate and intensify. We'll probably see Chasov Yar fall over the course of this month, and we will probably see the collapse of the Ukrainian forces in Kursk region, and we're going to probably see major battles take place east of the Dnieper as the Russians work to destroy the forces in southwest Donbass and in southern and eastern Dnipro region as well. So there will probably be, in my opinion, on the contrary, an intensification of the fighting. And I think that all of this talk about drones and the success of Ukrainian drones and all of that is heavily misplaced. There's an article about this in the New York Times today, talking about how drones are now the major weapon, how the Ukrainians and the Russians each produce around 1 million drones a year. The reality is that the Russians are steadily moving forward in the drone war. The Russians are said to be producing around 4,000 FPV drones a day. That's around 1.5 million drones a year. The Russians have been increasingly successful in jamming Ukrainian communications, including communications to their drones. The Ukrainians are able to use the Starlink system to control their drones, at least to some extent. But the Russians are also able, apparently, to jam the sensors that the drones are using, and are doing it increasingly successfully. And besides, the Russians, to a much greater extent than the Ukrainians, are gradually, in fact not gradually, rapidly developing protections against Ukrainian drones. We've already seen that with the specialized armor that the Russians have added to their armored vehicles. And the New York Times article said that Ukraine soldiers on each side now have to walk across territory to reach each other's positions. Well, that happens in some places, but the Russians do manage to conduct armored attacks. And as I said many times, strikes on armored vehicles by FPV drones anyway are not always as effective as people assume. And if we're talking about strikes on Ukrainian armored vehicles, I think in most cases the strikes that do the real damage, that destroy the vehicles, are not carried out by FPV drones, but by the much bigger and far more powerful drones that the Russians have in abundance, like the Lancets and the others. And they're confused with the FPV drones because those are the drones that people talk about all the time. But anyway, all of this is going on. The balance in the drone war over the course of this year is going to start tilting ever more heavily towards the Russians. It has already started to do so. There's even pictures of the Russians building protected roadways by creating elaborate netting over the main supply roads leading to the positions that the Russians launched their main attacks from. So we see those sort of steps being taken by the Russians. And of course, the other thing that's been happening is that the Russians have been hunting successfully Ukrainian drone operators. There have been strikes on Ukrainian positions. There was a massive strike, apparently last night, on a training center. Supposedly around 150 Ukrainian soldiers were killed and 30 foreigners as well. That may or may not be true. I can't possibly confirm this, but those are the reports that are circulating. But there's also been reports circulating that the Russians have been targeting successfully Ukrainian drone operators. So one way or the other, I'm going to make the prediction that even before the American aid runs out, just as we have been seeing happen over the last year, we're going to see the Russian advances continue. And they're probably, before the American aid runs out, also going to start accelerating because of another factor, and that is that the Ukrainians, who must be increasingly concerned about the fact that they will not get replacements for their Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and the shells, the 155mm shells that their M777 howitzers still fire and that kind of thing. And they must also be increasingly worried about the fact that their Patriot missile interceptors are going to start running out in short supply. Inevitably, they're going to want to drag out the use of those weapons by husbanding them, by avoiding running down what will be steadily depleting stockpiles. And whilst this might, of course, extend Ukraine's ability to go on using weapons beyond the midsummer, which is the time when most people expect the American weapons to run out. The fact that they will be doing that, the fact that they will be husbanding their use of weapons in the meantime, is also going to make it easier for the Russians to advance. They can start putting down, well, at the moment, the reports say that the Russians launch around 2 to 3 times more artillery shells on any particular day than the Ukrainians do. Well, the Russians may soon find that the number of shells that the Ukrainians can fire is actually reducing, not because the stockpiles are exhausted, but because they're starting to run down and that the Ukrainians have to husband their use. The same applies, for example, to HIMARS missiles, the missiles that the Ukrainians launch from the HIMARS system. There's a finite supply of these, and certainly there's a finite supply in Ukraine. The Ukrainians still use the HIMARS, despite the fact that it's regularly now jammed by the Russians, as the American media has in the past admitted. But the fact that the Russians are advancing, the fact that the Ukrainians know that they have now only a limited stockpile of HIMARS missiles left, and that the Americans are no longer replacing them, is going to make the Ukrainians fire their HIMARS missiles at an even lower rate than they are currently doing, even as Russian use of their equivalent systems, the Tornado S and the various other multiple launch rocket systems that the Russians have, steadily grows. So even over the next couple of months, we are going to start to see, I suspect, a steady deterioration in the Ukrainian position. So again, there's a lot of mythology about this, even as some people in the West continue to say that, the Europeans must come forward and make up the difference. Now, these claims about the Europeans plugging the gaps in Ukraine's forces are being made in Europe. There is, in my opinion, a fantastic article, absurd article in the Daily Telegraph by Ambrose Evans-Pritchard today about the massive rearmament program that Europe is about to launch, the conversion of Fiat car factories into building weapons of some kind. What precisely? I think, again, completely misunderstands how that is done, and the idea that you can just take car workers and retrain them and expect them to make ammunition or explosives or missiles or whatever it is, again, shows a basic failure to understand industrial practices. And, well, it can be done, but again, it requires levels of planning and organization which the European Union has never shown itself capable of. In fact, it has repeatedly shown itself incapable of. But anyway, there we go. And we can have bold and dramatic statements by Ursula von der Leyen talking about how Europe must transform Ukraine into a steel porcupine and all of that, equip and arm Ukraine to that kind of level. And we have statements apparently originating from Ukraine talking about Friedrich Merz as the new leader of the free world and looking to Germany to produce vast quantities of weapons to make up for Ukraine. I'm going to discuss all of this in a later program. Suffice to say that it is all completely unreal. It is fantasy. But anyway, none of that is going to happen in the next 3 months, or in the next year, or in the next 5 years. And whether it happens at all, it is not going to happen quickly enough to plug the gaps that the Ukrainian military is going to face as American support is withheld. But one can see what is going to happen. As Ukraine gradually loses ground, and then as that gradual process of losing ground turns into a rout. And I forgot to mention, by the way, that it's not just Ukraine's problem isn't just a shortage of weapons, which has never been solved and is now going to get far, far worse. As article after article has pointed out, in many places, Ukraine is now also critically short of manpower. The Russian Defense Ministry recently published a report saying that even in February, when the fighting was in some ways less intense, Ukrainian losses, according to the Russians, were still greater than replacements, whereas with the Russians, the opposite is true. Even as the Ukrainians gradually advance, gradually fall back, as the Russians gradually advance, even as the Ukrainian retreat starts to get faster and faster, and then starts to become a rout, well, the complaints, the chorus of criticism from all the usual places will grow. There'll be statements from the Europeans or from people in Europe, from the parts of the American media, from people like Senator Murphy in Congress, that the Trump and Vance are betraying Ukraine, that it's their fault that Ukraine is losing the war. There will be enormous pressure or growing pressure on the Americans to change course, to start re-equipping the Ukrainians again, to end the pause and to reverse their policy decision and indeed their entire policy course, and to recommit to supporting Ukraine again. As I said, the Ukrainians are counting on it, and they're also undoubtedly counting, or so I believe, on Trump and Vance and Hegseth and Rubio and Waltz and all of the others. If things go really wrong for Ukraine, panicking and changing their stance completely and coming to Ukraine's rescue in some form. The Trump team are going to require very strong will to see this off. And let me make it clear, that is exactly what they need to do. They should say to the Ukrainians, yes, the United States is in a position to help. They will do what they can to help the Ukrainians. But the position that the United States has taken, that the United States must give, that Ukraine must give, clear indications that it is finally willing to sit down and talk to the Russians and to negotiate peace, that remains the absolute precondition for any resumption of American aid, regardless of the situation on the battlefield. Now, as I said, that is going to require very, very strong nerves. But I'm going to say this, if the Americans are prepared to stick to that position, then there is perhaps a chance that finally things will change. That Zelensky, if he finally understands that the Americans mean what they say, that the situation in the United States is not going to shift, that he might finally tell the White House that he really is going to change course. He might even do what the Americans, I think, want him to do, which is to pack his bags and go to Kiev and make way for someone, maybe Prime Minister Schmeichel. He might be a stopgap figure who could do this, who could take his place, or the Speaker of the Parliament that Putin has spoken about as the man who might ultimately sign a deal, something of that kind. Anyway, he might decide at that point, or he might be persuaded at that point to go. But in order to get there, as I said, the Americans need to stay the course. Now, I think they will, and the reason I think that is not just because of what the Americans have been saying over the last couple of days, but because of an interview that the US Vice President J.D. Vance has given. Now, I was listening to this interview with great interest. He's given it over the last couple of hours. And I have to say, I found Vance, again, extremely impressive. He seems to understand the realities of the war very, very well. He made it absolutely clear what really happened during the events last week with Zelensky and American exasperation with Zelensky himself. And the point is that I think that Vance has shown not just an emotional repugnance at the way in which Zelensky acted, but an intellectual understanding of what is really going on. This has been true of Vance, in my opinion, well, ever since the failure of Ukraine's 2023 offensive, the famous vaunted summer offensive, which General Milley and all of those people cobbled together with Zaluzhny and Zelensky and Admiral Radakin of Britain, which ended so disastrously. So I think that Vance, who is, as far as I'm concerned at least, coming across as an increasingly impressive figure, I think he understands what is going on. I think Musk does. And I think that they will advise Trump to stay the course. And I think that is also Trump's inclination as well. And I think that the political position of the Trump team in the United States is sufficiently strong that they can see whatever desperate pleas come from Zelensky and his people for a change of stance, or from their friends in the United States, or from their continued friends in Europe. I think they're strong enough to see it through. Now, let's quickly, briefly pivot back to the Europeans. The show of unity that they put on in London is already beginning to crack. I discussed yesterday how the British immediately began to distance themselves from Macron's vainglorious demand for a ceasefire, a 1-month ceasefire, which wasn't a ceasefire. Meloni has now come out, and it seems to me what she's trying to say is that the Europeans shouldn't take any step at all, which the Trump people don't agree with. The cracks on Meloni's part, the differences between Meloni and the European hardliners are once again beginning to show. I think within Germany, we will also see the divisions grow as well. And the Germans still seem to be very, very unhappy about the whole idea of deploying troops to Europe also. Now, over the course of their meeting in Istanbul, which also took place on Friday, by the way, or Thursday of last week, the Russians and the Americans apparently discussed not just the unblocking of their respective embassies in their respective countries, but they also discussed re-establishing air links. This was apparently a Russian proposal. Commercial flights from Moscow to New York and that kind of thing, which, by the way, I believe can reach America, even if they don't have to fly over European airspace, on the most unlikely assumption that European airspace remains blocked. I cannot imagine the European Union preventing American carriers from sending flights to Russia. But, the Russians and the Americans, if that were to happen, they could route their flights across North Africa, for example. I believe that some aircraft have a sufficient range to do that in a direct flight. Just saying. But even if they don't, they can stop off and refuel in North Africa and that kind of thing. If those kind of flights are resumed, then I presume Boeing, at least, by the way, would resume repairs and maintenance for Boeing aircraft still operated by Russian airlines, even though I don't expect that to change Russian policy, which is ultimately to replace all Western airliners, all Western aircraft on their airlines with domestically produced ones. But that's a topic for another day. But anyway, I presume that, as I said, long-range aircraft can do this. But even if they can't, they can still arrange stopovers. It would lengthen the flight time, but you would still have air links between Moscow and New York and Moscow and Washington and all of that, probably. Anyway, moving forward. Apparently, there is word out now that the Americans are going to start looking at lifting other sanctions as well. They're talking they're talking to the Russians about, or rather they're discussing with themselves what sanctions they might be prepared to lift. That's already going to have a further effect on the dynamics of this, and it's going to cause European unity to crack further still. The European Union is still talking about further sanctions against Russia. Yesterday there was a long article in the Financial Times about the Europeans moving forward and confiscating Russian frozen assets, taking the Russian frozen assets at last. Well, now the French are publicly speaking out against this. The French economy, finance minister Eric Lombard has now said that this will be a step that contradicts international agreements signed by France and the European Union. France's position is that these assets belong to the Central Bank of Russia. I would like to remind you that we are not in a state of war with the Russian Federation. He went on to say that in his opinion and in the opinion of France, these assets cannot be confiscated. That's a statement from the French government. The French in the past have looked like they were prepared to go along with this idea. Now they're rowing back. They know that the Americans are thinking of rowing the sanctions back. We can see that the French are taking a different line on this than the British, for example, who are still pressing for the confiscation of the assets are. Sooner or later, as the Americans lift the sanctions, so will the Europeans do also. In fact, we are going to start to see European states, not just Hungary and Slovakia, but other states, Italy, Spain, even France, perhaps Germany before long, going to start take unilateral steps to ease sanctions, even if the European Union, the European Centre, holds out against this. So nobody should take these protestations of unity in Europe entirely seriously. The Americans, provided they stick to their course, will prevail. They will prevail probably with the Ukrainians. They will prevail with the Europeans. What the Russians will do is something else, which I'm going to discuss. Is something else to talk about. And I will discuss that in my next program. I will also, by the way, be discussing in my next program these rumors about the Americans now taking steps to restart Nord Stream 2. They're floating all over the internet, and I'm going to discuss that in my next program. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X and others. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.